The tunes in this final video, with two exceptions, are from Marshall's last years. When leaving Keithmore in 1822, he wrote The Farewell. He said that might be his last tune, but it did not prove to be so. A final book of his tunes appeared in 1845, published posthumously. In it are fine jigs, reels and suspets as you would expect, but also one or two surprises. To get us off to a cheerful start, here is a jig unusually in 9/8 time, it's usually 6/8, the Countess of Seafield. Who was she? Well, we've met her before. She was Christina Theresa Murray, who was briefly married to the Earl of Findlater and Seafield, the man who absconded to Saxony when Lady Jane Maxwell took exception to a rather coarse joke. However, this is a cheerful tune. Here it is, the Countess of Seafield. Say there were one or two surprises in this final book, and here is the first of them. This is a tune, an air, called Lady Forbes of New and Ailing Lassie. Now Marshall had already written a very fine suspect for her husband, Sir Charles. This tune is rather different and unusual for William Marshall. Here it goes, an air. But Scots, we'll see that it particularly is. It's much more like one of these drawing room tunes, classical tunes, that were popular in Edinburgh and more so even in London. Now, for the next tune I have to turn back in the book. This is Mr. Hoy's tune, Mr. Hoy of Gordon Castle. Who was Mr. Hoy? Well, he was a clever man. He was the Duke's librarian and meteorologist. He shared interests in science with William Marshall. And like William Marshall, he was rather humbly born. He was the son of an estate gardener born in Selkirk. The three men, that is Mr. Hoy, I don't know his first name, William Marshall and the Duke, would often walk round the gardens at the castle, talking in an animated way about the scientific things that interested them. And indeed, in these conversations, they were equals, though the social distance, of course, was very considerable. Anyway, for Mr. Hoy, Marshall wrote what was for him, again, a most unusual tune. This is a minuet. Mr. Hoy's tune. There's another tune in the 1822 collection, which I haven't played to you before, which is unusual, even more unusual in a way, because it's the one and only Lament, that William Marshall ever wrote. And he wrote it as a lament for Sir Harry Niven Lumsden of Achendoir. Sir Harry Lumsden lived and was a prominent member of the community on part of the land that was the Duke of Gordon, and William Marshall, as his factor, visited Achendoir, I suppose, fairly frequently, and must have got to know Sir Harry fairly well, I think. But Sir Harry died, sadly, as quite a young man, 35 years old. Now, it so happened that he died in 1822, not long before the big book was published, not long before Marshall went down to Edinburgh to supervise the publication. And I think this tune is personal. I think that he must have liked Sir Harry, and I think it must have been a sad thing when the man died. Anyway, the tune is a fine one. The Lament for Sir Harry Lumsden. In 1818, when Marshall was 70, when he reached the age of 70, he was accorded an honour by the Duke and Duchess of Gordon because they commissioned a portrait which was painted by a man called J. Moyer. And this is the portrait of William Marshall, aged 70, their faithful servant and distinguished Scots music composer. Not only did they commission the portrait, but they also hung it in the gallery in Gordon Castle, beside illustrious forebears of the Gordon family. So the houseboy aged 12, the house servant, hung with the good and the great, and it was nice that that's happened. The portrait now is in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, and in fact there are only 4 Scottish composers who have their portraits there. 2 are Thea Musgrave and Francis George Scott, and the other 2 are William Marshall and Neil Gow, painted by Sir Henry Raeburn, who hang side by side. It's nice to see them there. Back to the 1845 book. Here's a tune written for the Duchess of Gordon. There it is. And, actually there it isn't, it's the page before, but it doesn't matter. Here's a tune for the Duchess of Gordon, who richly deserved to have a tune in the book. She was the 5th Duchess of Gordon. She had been Marchioness of Huntly and a great supporter of William Marshall. She eagerly encouraged him to publish that book in 1822, and not only did she encourage him, she bought 700 copies. A year or 2 before he died, she and her husband accorded him the great honour of an invitation to stay as a guest in the castle. Now that was quite something, most unusual for a former servant to stay there as a guest, and quite touching for the old man who had served the family so well. It must have meant a lot to him. So here is her tune, the Duchess of Gordon, from that final book. For Marshall, again, an unusual tune, because, again, it's a minuet. It's a nice minuet. apologies to the shade of the Duchess of Gordon and also to William Marshall for playing one very obvious wrong note round about halfway through that, but you get the idea. Anyway, that was the Duchess of Gordon. That was the tune that he wrote for her. William Marshall died on the 19th of May, 1833. He was 85 years old. His pupil, Charles Grant, a farmer's son, who had qualified as a teacher, having done a degree at Aberdeen University, played to him and for him on his last day and indeed in his last moments, because Marshall had asked or had said that he would like to enter heaven to the sound of music. His grave, a family grave, is in Belly Kirkyard in Forbes. Colonel William, his son, remember the man who lost his arm at Quatre Bras, was responsible for moving the gravestone, which had been at Dandalyth, to Belly Churchyard, and on it he composed and he had written this tribute. Erected by Lieutenant Colonel William Marshall as sincere but inadequate tribute to the memory of a revered parent. This stone was originally placed by William Marshall over the grave of his son, Major Alexander Marshall, who died at Keithmore on the 31st day of January 1807, in the 33rd year of his age, and of his spouse, Jean Giles, who died at Newfield Cottage, Dandalyth, on the 13th day of December 1824, in the 85th year of her age, both whose remains are interred here. Here also lie the remains of William Marshall, Esquire, husband of the above Jean Giles, a man of virtue and integrity. From a humble station in life, he rose to distinction by the industrious cultivation of a natural talent. Eventually he became factor to Alexander, his Grace the Duke of Gordon, an office he held for many years, performing his duties with fidelity and to the satisfaction of his employer and his tenants. Although self-taught, he made considerable progress in mechanics and other branches of natural science, to which his leisure hours were frequently devoted. But he was chiefly noted for his skill and fine taste in music, the Scottish airs and melodies composed by him being widely known and appreciated. He died universally esteemed at Newfield Cottage on the 29th day of May, 1833, in the 85th year of his age. It is said that William Marshall virtually invented the strathspey. Now, whether that's true or not, he certainly made it one of the central tunes in Scots music, not just fiddle music. The most versatile, characterful, and expressive. The name, of course, derives from the 100-mile-long river, which winds its way through beautiful countryside to the Murray Firth at Tugnet by Spey Bay. So, the last tune we're going to hear is a strathspey, and it's called The Banks of Spiritus, and here it is. William Marshall rose from houseboy, aged 12, to house steward. He was a successful farmer and a respected factor for his duke. The inscription on the gravestone appropriately mentions the tenants who respected and often admired him. He was skilled in mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, and surveying, and in some of these he was largely self-taught. He made beautiful and intricate long case clocks. He was nationally famous as a player and composer of Scots tunes. He was the father of 6 children, all of whom did him proud. Latterly, he was a justice of the peace. Universally esteemed, the gravestone tells us, universally esteemed he was. Of him, Charles Skinner wrote, "The aged composer of Strathspey lived and died near the banks of the Spey, and the ripple and surge of the flowing river, as it sings itself to the sea, find an echo in the melodies of William Marshall."